Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. I'm going to be chairing today. I'm standing in for Gustav and sitting in. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today. Quill Kukla is Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University and a fellow at the Socrates Center at Leibniz University, Hanover. They're also affiliated professor at Queen's University Belfast, Technische Universität Berlin, and the University of Johannesburg. It says here that you got your PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh in '96. And Quill's research is very wide-ranging. They work in ethics, including bioethics, sexual ethics, health communication ethics, but also feminist and anti-oppression philosophy, philosophy of science, especially medicine and geography, philosophy of language, social epistemology, philosophy of place and urban theory, and aesthetics. They've published widely on a range of these topics. So I'll mention just a couple of things that you might be interested in. A recent publication from 2024, Healthism, Elite Capture, and the Pitfalls of an Expansive Concept of Health. And a forthcoming book, which you may be interested to know about, or is it out now? Sex Beyond Yes?
Yes, it exists, but it's not released. They're holding it back.
So you can soon look out for Sex Beyond Yes, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone. So Quill. Quill's going to talk to us today about healthism, neurodiversity, and respectability politics. So welcome.
Thank you. I was just telling Joe, I've only given this talk a couple of times, and it has a lot of moving parts, so I'm working on making it efficient so that it's not too long. So I'm going to move fairly quickly, but hopefully I've also heard we have a nice long question period. So anything I go over too quickly, we can get back to. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is a beautiful spot and a fun trip so far. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about neurodiversity and health. I'm going to be focusing mostly on autism, but not entirely. I'll also be talking a little bit about ADHD and to some extent some other neurodivergent conditions. But the first thing I want to point out is that for the most part, neurodivergent conditions tend to be framed and managed through what we can think of as a health lens. They are thought of as pathologies that should be treated if possible. So, for example, autism has been listed in the last several DSMs as something that can be diagnosed by a health professional. If you look at big international health organizations like the WHO and many others, they all have statements about having autism. Their presence within those organizations indicates that they are seen as health concerns, but also the grammar of having autism often, or having X, often flags that we see something as a disease, right? We don't talk about having smartness, but we do talk about having cancer. Scientific articles about autism tend to have this little rhetorical tick. I've noticed, I do a lot of work on science communication, and I've noticed that scientific articles in different areas often have little rhetorical ticks where it becomes sort of almost de rigueur to start your article with a little phrase that indicates that you're in the right literature. And so most scientific articles about autism start by mentioning that autism is a devastating disease, and then they go on to say whatever else. But if you think about it for even a moment, it becomes clear that it's not obvious in what sense these conditions are health conditions. They're not standard morbidities in the sense that they don't in any obvious way reduce lifespan or reduce medical function. And it's not clear exactly what health means in this context. I'm going to be arguing that when it comes to neurodiversity, health is actually implicitly and sometimes explicitly defined in terms of respectability and social productivity and social non-disruptiveness. I'm also going to argue that more generally, defining individual health in any domain in terms of social palatability and in terms of the needs of other people rather than in terms of people's own flourishing is both conceptually troubling and ethically troubling. And that trying to treat neurodivergent people from within a health framework by trying to turn them into non-disruptive and efficient members of productivity culture is likely to backfire and to do harm both to them and to society at large. And so I'm going to claim that a health framework for thinking about neurodiversity is mostly inappropriate, although towards the end of my talk, I will argue that it's not always or entirely inappropriate. Before we get back to neurodiversity, I want to talk for a moment about the notion of healthism, which may be familiar to many of you, perhaps not all of you. This is a widespread ideology. Once you start noticing healthism, you notice it everywhere. It's incredibly structuring and pervasive. It's this idea that health is an indefeasible and privileged value. And it comes along with the idea that each of us is individually responsible for maximizing our health and socially responsible for enforcing good health practices, right? So if something is healthy, you're not allowed to just say, well, it's healthy, I know, but that is of no interest to me, right? Your own health is not allowed to be of no interest to you. People are obliged to value health and healthy living no matter what. And if something is framed as a health problem, then there becomes a social imperative to do something about it, right? So if you can't get a lot of social attention for some sort of problem, if you can manage to reframe it as a health problem, then it becomes in some sense undeniable that we have to be concerned with it. Going along with healthism is the idea that modulating and disciplining all aspects of your life in order to maximize health is some sort of required duty, right? So you're supposed to eat healthy food, maintain a healthy weight, build healthy relationships, sustain healthy boundaries, have a healthy attitude, feel healthy emotions, and so forth. That's what it is to be running your life well, right? But one of the problems with healthism is that we don't really know what health is. Health is extremely hard to define. And I would argue that the concept of health has been expanding and becoming more amorphous over time to the point where it's often simply equated with well-being. This is nowhere clearer than in the WHO definition of health, which is, on the one hand, much teased by philosophers and often by policymakers, but also it still remains the sort of standard bearer in international discussions of health policy and often within scientific articles. So the WHO says health is a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's probably immediately obvious to you that this means it's everything, right? Anything good is health by this definition. So, if you drop your favorite egg cup and it breaks and you're sad, you now have a health problem by this definition. There have been various tweaks on this, but they have, by philosophers in particular, but they've tended to keep this core idea that health and well-being are pretty much the same thing. So, for example, Sean Velez, who does philosophy of population health, tried to play around with this definition. And he says health is a life course trajectory of complete well-being in social contexts, but you still have this complete well-being idea, right? So if health becomes complete well-being, then that starts to extend health into all dimensions of our life. And we start to think in terms of spiritual health and healthy relationships. You often hear people talking about a healthy consumption of the news, right? Or a healthy relationship to Instagram or whatever it may be. So health expands. But the problem is, well-being is also not especially well defined, right? And so because if health is well-being, right, and well-being is just sort of some amorphous notion of good living wellness, right, it becomes very easy for our notion of well-being to be co-opted by our dominant norms of social respectability and conformism and productivity, right? Well-being just becomes running your life like you are socially supposed to, right? And healthism and health expansionism then feed off of one another. So when everything becomes part of health, healthism itself, which is already pervasive, starts to swallow all dimensions of life, and healthism and the expansion of health become mutually enforcing. This isn't all bad. I do think that framing something as a health issue can be really useful in terms of getting it a certain level of social legitimacy and earning it needed resources, right? I mentioned that earlier. If you can manage to frame something as a health issue, it gives you much more of a claim on social resources for it. Framing something as a health question can also help shape scientific questions and research agendas. It definitely helps with getting insurance coverage, right, which is a hugely important reason. It can also remove stigma and moral meanings to various conditions and more. It's the classic example here is something like alcoholism, which used to just be seen as a moral failing. And when it was reframed under a disease model, it took away a lot of the moral stigma, but also earned it a lot more social support and funding and so forth. But when the notion of health becomes overexpansive, I want to claim that it can be weaponized as a tool of social control and used to enforce conformism and respectability. And what can happen when you combine healthism with health expansionism is that health can stop being about individual flourishing or thriving, and instead it can start to be about not disrupting the social order and not disrupting other people's convenience or comfort and meeting social standards for productive and respectable living. This is all very general, and we're not talking about neurodiversity yet. Okay, so let's get back to neurodiversity. I'm going to stay on autism for a while, although, like I said, I'm going to talk later again about ADHD. So, in what sense is autism a health problem? Well, first of all, it is clear that it can lead to health problems, including anxiety, depression, self-harm, risk-taking, and addiction. These are all common sequelae of autism. But it's not in any clear sense an illness or a loss of function, and it has no direct connection to mortality, and there is no such thing as a cure for autism. We know that in suitable contexts, many autistic people can flourish without any apparent dysfunction or suffering, right? Many autistic advocates want to claim that autism is not only not a health problem, but not any kind of a deficit, right? They want to argue that it's a difference with its own value rather than any kind of deficit and disorder, and that autistic ways of living and thinking add valuable diversity to society. I'm not going to actually come down on whether the claim in that sharp form is true. I do want to say that even if autism is in some sense a disadvantage or a deficit, there are downsides to treating every single disadvantage or deficit as a health problem. So that doesn't yet settle the question of whether we should think of it within a health framework. Okay. But I do want to argue, and this will be developed throughout the rest of this talk, that autistic people's main problem, both for themselves and for other people, is that they make neurotypical people uncomfortable and don't follow their respectability norms and their efficiency norms. And this has costs both for neurotypical culture and people and for autistic people themselves. And I'm going to argue that understanding autistic challenges within a health framework is confused and harmful. In order to make this case rigorously, I'm going to keep looking at my phone because I don't want to go way over time. I know this talk has a tendency to expand, so I'm going to be on top of it. In order to make this case, it helps to look at actual official attempts out there to define autism. Interestingly, official definitions of autism and varieties of autism universally focus not on the individual, but on people's interactions with others viewed from a neurotypical point of view. So, for example, if you look at DSM-5, there are 3 necessary criteria for autism. You have to meet all 3. And then there's a list of markers, a big list, and you have to have at least 2 members of that list, but it's not determined which ones. You don't have to have all of them. So the 3 that you have to have are 1, this is the language from DSM, difficulties in social reciprocity, conversation, expressing emotions, sharing interests. 2, difficulties in nonverbal communication used for social interaction. 3, difficulties in developing and maintaining relationships with others. And then the longer list that you don't have to have all of includes things like having special interests, having intense focus, having sensory sensitivities, and a bunch of other things. What's interesting to notice right off the bat is that all 3 of these main criteria, if we can just focus on those for a moment, could have equally been framed in terms of neurotypical people having these difficulties with autistic people, right? So we could equally have framed these as difficulties. I'm not even going to go through all 3. It's obvious, right? If you have difficulties in communication, communication is a symmetrical process. That means the other person has difficulties in communication too. It is impossible for 2 people to be trying to communicate and only one of them to be having difficulties in communication. Let's put it that way, right? So these are all interactive difficulties, but they're framed as difficulties with the individual. This is known within autism affirming advocacy and research circles as the double empathy problem, right? Putting this as a double empathy problem is reframing these three criteria as interactive difficulties that go both ways, rather than difficulties that show an inherent disorder on the part of the autistic person. And backing this up is the fact that this research is very nascent, and I don't want to claim stronger weight for it than it has, but there is growing research and lots of anecdotal evidence showing that autistic people do not particularly have these difficulties with one another. These are difficulties between autistic people and neurotypical people. I think you can more clearly see how autism is defined in terms of trouble they cause for neurotypical people if we turn to the more fine-grained attempts to distinguish between varieties of autism rather than to just define autism in general. So there have been lots of attempts to do this, right, to within a diagnostic framework, create an official hierarchy of autistic people, dividing them into the good ones, the medium ones, and the bad ones. All of these are about ranking autistic people in terms of how disruptive they are to other people and how well they can fit in with productivity culture. So the big famous original attempt to do this was to separate, and I'm sure you know this, to separate out people with Asperger's syndrome from the rest of autistic people. Asperger's is no longer a recognized diagnosis in DSM or in most countries. The history of Asperger's syndrome is that it was literally Asperger himself was a Nazi doctor, and he created a category of good autistic people. They were specifically defined as the ones who could still be socially useful and productive. So there was a value to integrating them into the Volk rather than killing them. Like that was explicitly what the criterion was could they be useful and productive, and hence should their lives be saved. Even though this diagnosis doesn't exist anymore, it is still often used by parents of autistic kids in particular to somehow indicate that their kid is not one of those disruptive, uncomfortable autistic people, but one of the clever, useful, good autistic people. That's a debunked label. So after we got rid of Asperger's, we moved on to a distinction between high-functioning and low-functioning autistic people. Unfortunately, high-functioning autistic people are defined quite literally, again, as those who can do what neurotypical culture demands of them. High functioning in this context means that you can do things like hold a normal job without a lot of accommodation and so on. So high functioning was never defined in terms of autistic people's own needs and well-being. And it's interesting to me how infrequently people, to call something high functioning is to say that it functions well at something. But people rarely ask high functioning with respect to what when it comes to high functioning autism. And what really drove this point home to me, and actually was one of the things that first got me really interested in this project and thinking really carefully about this issue, is when I read several good quality articles showing that so-called high functioning autistic people, people who actually have that diagnosis, have substantially higher rates of anxiety and depression than so-called low-functioning autistic people, right? So from their own perspective, high-functioning autistic people are sadder and more anxious and more stressed out, which it seems to me immediately raises the question, high-functioning for whom and for what purpose, right? Not for autistic people's own purposes. High functioning and low functioning are now seen as problematic terms because they're so obviously hierarchical and elitist. And so we've gotten rid of that. And now we talk about level 1, 2, and 3 autism, which I think is actually a tiny bit better the way it's framed, but it obviously has some of the same problems. So level 1 autistic people are defined as requiring low support in order to function socially in respectable social productivity culture. And level 2 requires more support. Level 3 requires the most support. I do think framing things in terms of the need for support is better, but we all need support. How much support we need varies by context, right? None of you, wrapped yourself in the pelts of animals you killed and foraged in order to get here. So we all require just absolutely massive amounts of support in order to function. So really, what we're talking about here is not that some people need a lot of support. We're talking about the fact that they need different or non-normative support or statistically less usual support than other people, right? And all of us need more or less support depending on what we're up to and depending on our context and depending on our skill set. Moreover, needing support, I believe, should not in and of itself be thought of as a pathology or a disorder, right? Babies need ridiculous amounts of support, and we don't think of them as pathological in virtue of being babies. Support is just a thing that people need at different times. Because we all need support and we all need different amounts of support at different moments in our life and in different contexts, I would argue that what this classification of level 1, 2, and 3 really measures is just distance from the statistical norm in terms of what support somebody needs and their use of social resources, right? So it's really, again, defined in terms of imposition on traditional neurotypical culture or making being in friction with normal neurotypical culture. Also, obviously, using the terms 1, 2, and 3 still has a kind of an elitist ranking effect. All of these different attempts to rank autistic people have been rejected by autistic advocacy groups who have argued that they all encourage hierarchy and ableism and measure autistic people in terms of how disruptive they are to neurotypical people and culture. Now, it is true, there's no denying it, that autistic people and ADHD people, I'm going to bring them back in here, often don't behave respectably and genuinely are disruptive, right? So here are some of the standard behaviors of neurodivergent people that are socially disruptive. Non-standard eye contact is standard. Not performing emotions in socially expected ways, either like not having the expected emotion or not manifesting it in a socially expected way, violating norms of conversation. So things like having standard rhythms of turn taking and exiting and entering conversations are often issues for not neurodivergent people. Stimming is almost universally an issue for neurodivergent people. So, moving their body repetitively in a way that is not socially standard. Failing to start and stop activities according to others' timing expectations is a huge deal for almost all neurodivergent people. Both inability to start something when you should and then inability to task switch and so forth. Fascinatingly, it's clearer and clearer that among neurodivergent people, especially autistic, but not only, there are just hugely high rates of both queer and trans people, which is almost definitionally socially disruptive for respectability culture. And this one really interests me, especially autistic people tend to just be wired not to experience social conventions as natural. And as a result, they don't automatically, unreflectively seem either worth following or easy to follow. There needs to be a sort of a critical reflection on what the social norm is supposed to be, whether it's a good idea to follow it and how to do so. And that makes conformist behavior more difficult. None of these things on this list are inherently harmful or dysfunctional for the individuals who do them, of course. But within a highly coordinated bureaucratic division of labor, all of these behaviors can lead to genuine inefficiency and discomfort. And if we're in a system that rewards conventional behavior, which to some extent we have to be, right, they can make functioning difficult for the people who have these behaviors, and they can make other people uncomfortable. I want to argue now, this is a real shift in the paper, I want to argue that in order to understand all these differences in a way that is helpful and not inaccurate or ableist or elitist, it's helpful, instead of using a health framework, to try to understand neurodivergence through what I think of as an attentional difference framework. Now, I don't want to claim that attentional differences exhaust the entirety of neurodivergence, but I do want to claim that attentional diversity and attentional difference is a really deep, essential component of neurodiversity. This is true for autism, for ADHD, for obsessive compulsive disorder, dyslexia, a wide range of neurodivergences. And thinking of neurodivergence in terms of attentional difference is just a different way of framing it other than through a health framework. So let me talk for a couple slides about what this means, right? In some sense, we've always known this. It's right in the name of ADHD, right? Which is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So there was an old school idea about attention and neurodivergence, which is that ADHD is a matter of insufficient attention, right? Not enough attention. Again, that's right in the name. It's a deficit. And autism is too much attention, right? The stereotype of autism is somebody like fixated on some detail or special interest and not being able to break attention. I want to argue that both of those, like ADHD is too little, autism is too much, are much, much too simple. But it is true that attentional difference is at the center of neurodivergence. So both ADHD and autism can, for example, and frequently do, involve hyperfocus, which is attention that is really solid and hard to break. Monotropism, which is similar to hyperfocus but actually different. Monotropism is when your attention screens out other stimuli so that your attention is only focused on the central thing you're working on. Special interests. This is more typical of autism, but also shows up in ADHD, which is, seemingly unlimited attention for particular topics. Time blindness. This one is especially ADHD, but also shows up in autism, which is inability to attend to how much time has passed as you're doing whatever you're doing. By the way, this is, again, emerging research, but right now it looks like there's probably about a 75% overlap between ADHD and autism. So it's becoming less and less obvious that these are two neatly separable conditions. And so this is part of why we see a lot of overlap here. Distractibility, again, this one is more associated with ADHD, which is where your attention is easily captured by a new topic or a new stimulus. And this one actually has no great name, but I'm going to call it hyperperceptivity. It often goes along with what gets labeled as sensory processing disorder, although I would claim the disorder language is biasing the description. Hyperperceptivity is the tendency to take in a huge swath of the environment without screening out what would be background for neurotypical people, right? And I think this one is related to hyperperceptivity. You get non-standard salience, which is the tendency to notice patterns or categories or details that would have stayed in the background for neurotypical people, right? So all of these, I think, are more complicated than just not enough attention or too much attention. Behind all these differences, there are, I want to argue, two basic types of attentional motors. And I'm going to do a fun little thought experiment for you that everybody always enjoys around this. Okay, so the two basic types, the name is pretty much everything, right? One is interest-based attention, which is when you attend to something because it captures your interest right now, right? Needs-based attention is attending to something because you need to attend to it in order to control future consequences, to attain future benefits or avoid future punishments or disasters or meet your needs, right? Everybody has, or I guess maybe almost everybody has, some combination of both interest-based attention and needs-based attention. And which one you're using shifts from situation to situation, but you may have them in very different proportions. Some people are really interest-driven in their attention, some people are really needs-driven. And here's my fun little thought experiment. Think about a time when you're really trying to attend to something, but you're having trouble doing it, which we've all had, right? If you're trying to force yourself to attend, which trick is your first go-to? Do you tell yourself about all the terrible things that are going to happen to you if you don't get your act together and pay attention, right? Or all the great things that will happen to you if you manage to attend? Or do you try to find some trick to make the task interesting? Yeah. And I think like we all do both, right? But I think for most of us, one of those is our go-to. And that will tell you if you're basically interest-driven or needs-driven in your attention. Autistic people and people with ADHD often have extremely strong interest-based attention and very little capacity for needs-based attention. And that means that future rewards and punishments and future consequences often don't motivate neurodivergent people, even if they really want them to, right? So please understand, because I've gotten this question, having a deficit of needs-based attention is not the same as not caring about the consequences. Oftentimes, neurodivergent people, especially ADHD people, will sit there miserable at the fact that they know that something terrible is going to happen because they're not paying attention and they don't want the terrible thing to happen. They would like the terrible thing to not happen, but that doesn't actually succeed in shifting their attention, right? So it's not about whether you manage to care about future consequences. It's about whether that caring is what directs your attention, or whether it's your interest that directs your attention. Okay, so neurodivergent people, especially autistic and ADHD people, often very interest-driven in their attention, but neurotypical productivity culture strongly presumes and privileges need-based attention. So the world of productivity culture tends to motivate our behavior by way of incentives and punishments and various kinds of gamification that are highly needs-driven. It tries to capture our attention by making needs be, or at least appear to be, much more dire than they otherwise need to be. Things like long-range planning and task switching according to need is treated as a virtue and as part of like a good work ethic in our culture. And to oversimplify, I think our culture is one where the general idea is suffer now, be rewarded later, right? Which is a needs-based way of trying to make people run their life. Okay, this is the last complicated bit of the talk that I get introduced. No, actually, there's one more after this, but I'm great. I've only gone for half an hour. In order to think about how needs-based attention is woven into our culture and what that means for people who are interest-based, I want to borrow this notion from Sarah Hendren, who's she's a design engineer and a disability studies theorist, and she talks about clock time and crip time. She argues that productivity culture relies on clock time, which is to say, so we all know, right? We all learned ages ago that in order for society to accomplish various complicated tasks like building bridges or running a government or whatever, we need a differentiation of labor, right? Different people have different jobs, and those jobs are coordinated with one another. It's obvious once we point out, but not often remarked, that that differentiation of labor and coordination also has to be temporal, right? It's not just that we each have different tasks, but that those tasks have to be temporally coordinated with one another in order for things to happen, right? We need to be able to sync our timing and our pace. And this is true for everything from factory assembly lines to bureaucratic offices, right? So efficiency and respectability then require sharing a clock, which is to say that we need to coordinate and regulate our attention and our action. And when people violate the shared clock, this is disruptive and inefficient as far as the system of differentiated labor goes, right? So productivity and respectability culture call for what I like to think of as a choreography of attention, which is coordinated by the shared clock. We have to be attending to the right things at the right time relative to what other people are doing in order for the whole thing to work. In that context, interest-based attention can be a serious disability, right? If you have difficulty with shifting tasks on cue and meeting deadlines and completing boring tasks, you're going to have trouble coordinating on clock time in the way that we need to, choreographing your attention with other people. Crip time, this is not a notion that Hendren invented. This has been a concept that's live within disability studies for quite some time. Right? Crip time is a concept that is supposed to recognize that just like people vary in their physical capacities, people vary in their pacing and their temporality. And a lot of valuable creative activity is not done on shared clock time. Now, I'm not just bashing clock time because we need many people on clock time. Like I said, you can't build a bridge if you don't have people on clock time. There's many, many things that we need people to be coordinating in this way in order to accomplish. But we don't need everyone to be on clock time, and other forms of action and attention are also important and valuable. So, there just isn't a reason for artists, for example, to be on clock time. There's various people who are doing various kinds of things that don't need to fit into this choreograph of attention, right? That's not to devalue clock time. Just like if I say not everybody needs to be a physician, I'm not saying that physicians aren't valuable, right? We need physicians, but that doesn't mean that you're somehow a little bit worse if you're not a physician. You're just not one of those people. But Hendren points out violating clock time is highly stigmatized. This is a really interesting point that she makes. In English, at least in a North American context, the word retarded has come to be like one of the most stigmatized slurs that there is. It's certainly the most stigmatized slur with respect to ableism. And she points out it's actually a temporal insult, right? The worst thing you can be, according to our language, is temporally on a different track from other people. She says, and here she's not talking about neurodiversity, she says, the pace set in contemporary schools and workplaces presumes a form of able-bodied productivity, an ideal of speed and efficiency. That's not a literal clock, but the one in the background, invisible yet always ticking. It's a mismatch for all kinds of people because it's not simply a timepiece. It's an economic instrument. The body and mind are a combined organism with infinite complexity, but the measures at hand are those of the clock. Whether and how the social cognitive mind and body of a person is checking off the milestones for a given set of skills in a timely way. Honestly, that quote always stresses me out. I feel like there's this clock trying to control me, right? And this idea that we should regulate our bodies and activities to the shared clock is rarely questioned. As a result, I want to claim that neurodivergent forms of attention are stigmatized and disruptive within productivity culture, but they also have some serious advantages. Right? Not always. Sometimes they have disadvantages. But hyperfocus, for example, can lead to really deep research and drive. Hyperperceptivity can be really painful. It can lead to sensory overwhelm, but it can also lead to the discovery of significant patterns and to creativity. Special interests can lead to deep expertise, and they can also lead to the ability to stick with a project way past the official bare minimum that you need in order to count as having finished it. This next one especially interests me. I think that non-standard salience, the tendency to sort of focus on the wrong things, can actually interestingly help people question social presuppositions and see through ideologies that rely on people not stopping to ask why they're in place. Neurotypical culture doesn't just demand specific forms of attention, which is what I was just arguing. It also suppresses certain forms of attention, right? It asks us not to ask, for example, why certain sort of norms are in place. And if you tend towards non-standard patterns of salience, and if you don't screen out backgrounds, you're not going to suppress that attention in the same way. Georgie Gardner has this paper where she argues that there are objective norms of attention and that we should pay attention to what objectively matters. And her example is, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, you're doing something objectively wrong if you pay attention to the bathrooms instead of to the art. I think this is deeply wrong. Like the Louvre, the art is cool, but I've got to say, when I've been to the Louvre, my main reaction has been, I've seen this art reproduced hundreds of times throughout my life, and it's only mildly more interesting seeing it in person, surrounded by hordes of people. I've never paid attention to the bathrooms at the Louvre, but it seems to me that doing so might give all sorts of cool insights into like gender and gender norms and class and architecture and who knows what. So I really reject this idea that there are objectively correct forms of attention. And I think that neurodivergent attention is not better, but it has its unique strengths, and it can be good for things like detective work, philosophy, where we see a huge selection bias towards neurodivergent people, art, science, and design. And, the culture has kind of like glommed onto this automatically. There's a lot of TV shows with stereotyped autistic people in these fields because people kind of know this, right? Okay, so final movement of the paper. Let's get back to health. How do people treat autism if they see it as a health condition? Well, the main treatment for autism, by far, the only really entrenched treatment, is so-called applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. It's always called the gold standard treatment in pretty much every country. It's given a directly medical framing. So according to the NHS and the CDC and various other bodies, ABA is the frontline gold standard treatment for autism. It's also almost always covered in every country by health insurance, and it's the only thing covered by health insurance that's directly framed as a treatment for autism. Right? Parents whose kids are diagnosed as autistic are pressured heavily to use ABA. Here we get back to healthism, right? Taking care of your health is not supposed to be optional. Taking care of your kids' health is not supposed to be optional. So in the name of being responsible for their kids' health, there's a heavy ethical and practical imperative on them to do ABA to treat their kids who have been diagnosed as having this health problem of autism. 4 key points about ABA. This is not my interpretation. This is just the bare bones definition of it. First, it's explicitly designed to make social behavior more normal and less disruptive. The treatment goal of ABA is officially social respectability and socially appropriate behavior. Second, it's an operant conditioning approach that is focused on behavior modification. That's the B of ABA, right? And it is not focused on the inner experience of the patient explicitly. If you read any description of ABA, it says our focus is not on how these things feel on the inside. It's about modifying behavior. Like all operant conditioning, it's based on a system of reward for good behavior, punishment for bad behavior. It's also extremely time intensive. So kids who do ABA often have to do hours and hours of training a day for years. Going back to the definition of autism I gave you towards the beginning of this talk, it's interesting to note that ABA is considered treatment in the name of health, right, to fix the health problem of autism. But it is, by definition, other-directed rather than self-directed. So you have a direct elision in the context of ABA of health with social respectability. So, for example, the big professional association for it says, ABA involves using scientific principles and procedures covered through basic and applied research to improve socially significant behavior to a meaningful degree. Right? The goal of ABA is to produce respectable behavior, not to eliminate experiences that do typically distress autistic people, which include things like sensory overwhelm and sensory sensitivities, self-harm urges, anxieties during social interactions, and so forth. Right? These things are just not addressed by ABA because subjective well-being is not the goal of it and it is not the success criterion. People who push ABA insist that it works, but as with the high functioning label that I discussed with you earlier, you should ask yourself, works to do what, right? So this was a couple of recent surveys that were very helpful and I hope eye-opening. Among autistic people who have in fact done ABA, 62% strongly disagree and 10% disagree that it should ever be used in any circumstances. And overall, 88% of autistic people oppose the use. It's hard to imagine another treatment where that huge of a percentage of people are unhappy with the treatment, and yet we say that it works and continue to treat it as a gold standard. Imagine if that many people said that whatever knee replacement surgery that they had should never be done because it's a form of torture. Claiming that it is successful is an interesting claim in the face of these statistics. Why do autistic people hate it so much? ABA is based on the premise that autism needs treatment to start with. I have about 5 to 6 minutes left. Is that good? Okay. Needs treatment to start with, and autistic ways of being should be eliminated. So many autistic people consider a hate crime, which is analogous to gay conversion therapy. They were, in fact, invented by the same people originally. It explicitly, by design, trains autistic people to hate and fear their own autistic traits and to associate them with negative reinforcement and punishment. It explicitly works to stigmatize and associate with negative reinforcement activities that originally bring joy, like pursuing special interests and stimming. And as a result, it kind of literally just robs joy from people's lives. We know that ABA harms health. It goes along with high rates of PTSD and depression. And one of the ways it works is by taking away people's tools for self-regulation and for managing distress, things like stims. And this can cause anxiety, pain, self-harm, and substance abuse. Autistic people who have gone through ABA much more likely to have substance abuse and self-harm problems, right? And in a qualitative study of people who had gone through it, autistic people reported harms to their sense of self, their agency, their ability to self-regulate. They reported few benefits and believed that the treatment was unethical and did not think that being made to behave normally should count as a valid treatment goal. Even by its own standards, the evidence that ABA works is pretty shaky, right? Like I said, it requires hours a day for years, and then people tend to relapse as soon as treatment ends. But why does it work so badly, right? Here, I'm sort of not on the same page as a lot of the autistic advocacy literature, which tends to say that, oh, it doesn't work because you're trying to make people change their true self. As a philosopher, I think the idea of a true self is kind of flaky nonsense. And any treatment tries to change people. I don't know how to distinguish between selves and true selves. So I would rather just get away from that language altogether. It's got metaphysical baggage that I'm not interested in taking on. But I think there are concrete other reasons why it's unlikely to work and especially likely to traumatize, which I've basically already given you, right? So ABA is based on reward for neurotypical behaviors and punishment for autistic behaviors. But I argued that people with interest-based attention are bad at modifying their behavior on that basis, right? So they may know that a reward or punishment is coming, but if the desired behavior doesn't interest or engage them, then it's very hard for them to attend to doing it. If you happen to be a parent of an autistic kid or an ADHD kid, you probably know that threatening punishment is a terrible way to try to bring about a behavior, right? If it's something like doing homework or putting away dishes or whatever, if it's not if it's something that doesn't engage the person's interest, then the threat doesn't engage their attention. It doesn't get anywhere. So the result is that with ABA, often people end up fearing the punishment, knowing the punishment is coming, feeling anxious and upset and inferior because they're constantly failing these tests over and over again, but not modifying their behavior because it's not suited to their form of attention. Because I would argue, when it comes to complex social behaviors, operant conditioning is based on a neurotypical model of attention. Okay. Do I think ABA is ever appropriate? One of the big critics of ABA, Wilkenfield and his team, have argued that ABA should only be used for preventing self-harm or seriously risky behaviors. Things like pica, which is like eating inappropriate things like dirt, headbanging, and eloping. So it should be used to keep patients safe, not for producing respectable behavior or satisfying other people's needs and comfort. But I want to go farther than him. I want to say that because the whole method is based on a mismatch with the attentional style of autistic people, operant conditioning is probably just a harmful and ineffective way to help people, even when the goals are benign in this sense. What do you do instead? Well, I would argue stop ignoring internal experiences and motivations of behavior and stop trying to produce external respectable behavior. So, for example, one better solution, understand the reasons underlying a behavior and try to change the environment to remove them, right? So why do autistic kids elope? There are several reasons. Sometimes you know what eloping is, right? It's when they just take off. Sometimes they elope because of sensory overload. So instead of punishing them, you can offer them quiet spaces or safe words for letting you know when they need to get out of a situation, or headphones, right? Sometimes they elope because of curiosity. You can help that by offering more variety and interest in their environment, taking them to places they're interested in, right? Rather than just punishing them for eloping. Another more productive response is to redirect harmful impulses by giving something that's genuinely interesting instead, but harmless, rather than punishing them for the harmful impulse, right? So some autistic kids tend to bite. Instead of punishing them when they bite, you can offer bite toys and chew candies. Some autistic kids have dangerous stims like headbanging because they need a lot of motion and sensory stimulation. Turns out one of the best ways of getting rid of that harmful behavior is to give them a trampoline rather than punishing them for doing it. The thing is, all of these solutions require understanding people's experiences and motivations and desires rather than just their external behavior. And crucially, none of these solutions produce normal, socially appropriate social behavior, right? Giving somebody a chew toy and a trampoline is not going to turn them into a normal looking member of conformist society. Okay. I am aware of time. So instead of going through this whole slide, I've just, at least one bit of it, I really want to hit. Am I saying that health is irrelevant to neurodivergence? No, not quite. Because neurodivergence often does become intertwined with health issues. Like I mentioned, self-harm, substance abuse, anxiety. Another big one is difficulty with medical and hygiene routines, right? And these things are, in fact, health problems. But I would suggest that we can focus on treating these narrower problems rather than framing it as treating autism or treating ADHD. We can frame it as health problems that arise in the context of autism and ADHD. And I love this analogy. I'm probably overly proud of it. We know that being a gymnast also often causes various health problems, right? Joint problems and so injuries and so on. But that doesn't make being a gymnast a disease. And when we treat health problems in a gymnast, we certainly take into account the context that they are a gymnast, and this is what they do with their body. We don't ignore that they're a gymnast when we treat their health problems, but we treat their health problems in the context of the fact that they are a gymnast rather than trying to treat away their gymnasticism, right? And I suggest that we should do the same thing for neurodivergent people. We should be attuned to the way that their health problems are in the context of and shaped by their neurodivergence, but not take ourselves as trying to treat the neurodivergence itself. So producing respectable, non-disruptive social behavior, I want to claim, is not itself a health matter, and having a different attentional structure is not a pathology or a disease, even though neurodivergences often go along with health conditions that need to be treated. So to conclude, other people's discomfort with someone should never be considered that person's health problem. We shouldn't elide the enforcement of respectability politics and conformity with clock time or the suppression of social nonconformism with health care. Even if it is true that sometimes we need to help people conform a little more than they do, that's not a matter of curing them of a health problem. Healthism plus health expansionism make this illusion too easy in general, not just for neurodivergent people, but I want to claim that neurodivergent people are easy special targets of this illusion. And finally, trying to train neurodivergent people to act normal not only harms them, but suppresses socially valuable creativity and critical thinking and cognitive diversity and often deep knowledge. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Quill. So now we'll open the question time. So first I'll just tell you a little bit about how we do it in case you haven't been here before. So if you're in the room, you can just raise your hand to ask a question. And if you're on Zoom, then you should type your name into the chat. We like to take questions from people with a variety of backgrounds. So if you're on Zoom, maybe also write your field of research. If you're a researcher, that helps us to get some diversity in the room. I guess I'll just guess and go for diversity. Yeah, I should know. We also use the question and follow-up convention. So if you want to raise a new question, you raise a whole hand. If you want to follow up on somebody else's question, you raise a single finger, and then you get threaded into the queue. On Zoom, you should write follow-up to so-and-so or whatever's happening now, and we'll figure it out.
And you'll call on people, right? I don't
I'll
need to keep
call
track
on
of
people,
it.
so
Great.
you can just answer. So any people would like to start? All right, why don't we start with Julia?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk and for bringing up attention to these very important topics. I thought it was very interesting, especially the attentional paradigm that you proposed at the end, and it was a very thorough description of all the features. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I would like to press, though, a little bit further on one of the points you made. And this disclaimer, I'm myself diagnosed and I'm very familiar with all of these conditions. And I also work on philosophy of disability, mostly on axiological and normative questions. But so that's a disclaimer. So what I would like to bring up again is the claim that you made at the beginning, that the main problem with these conditions is that they make neurotypical people uncomfortable, that they have inefficient behavior for society, and that it's not obvious that they reduce lifespan or medical function. I know that you kind of like softened this claim a little bit towards the end.
Yep.
I think that in general terms, there's truth to these claims, but I wonder how categorical we can be about them, or you want to be about them. So I was just thinking about the large body of evidence with respect to ADHD, the correlation between ADHD and substance abuse, substance dependence, highly represented among inmates in prison.
Right.
There's recent studies on the correlation between undiagnosed and untreated ADHD, especially among young women, and anxiety, burnout, depression, so on and so forth. I think you mentioned some of these with respect to autism too, when you referred to high functioning.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to autism, so we can think about social problems like inclusion, difficulties to be included in social settings, difficulties to sustain like a net of support, including friends. And so not that I'm not referring to the lack of social skills themselves as a problem, but to the negative consequences for their own well-being of lacking
Right.
those skills. So I'm thinking that people with autism, even if they're bad at making friendships, they want to have friends as well, and so there's bad
Right.
consequences that can come from that, and they also want to be taken care of and develop those type of relationships. So I do agree that maybe in some circumstances, conditions like this do not to be treated. Medically speaking, perhaps we don't want to refer to them as medical conditions either. You
Yeah.
provided a lot of good reasons for that. I wonder if then you would be willing to refer to them as disabilities.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that the notion of disability can be separated from this like medical component.
For sure.
Think about Elizabeth Barnes and other types of accounts, because I think that the risk would be that, I guess, like talking only about diversity can kind of like make invisible perhaps the problems that
Yes.
these people might struggle with.
So this is exactly why I said here on this slide, right, that autistic advocates often want to say it's just a difference and not a deficit. And I said I'm not going to actually come down on this in this talk, but that even if it is a genuine deficit or disability, that doesn't mean that health framing is the best one. So I explicitly distanced myself from this idea that it's just a mere difference. So, but yes, you raise a lot of important points that I agree with. What I want to claim is a couple things here. First of all, I definitely think it's a disability. I think we need very different accounts of what a disability is from what a health condition is. There are clearly people who have obvious disabilities who by any normal everyday standard of the use of the term count as super healthy, right? Like amputees who are Olympic athletes and so on, right? So disability and health are not the same. My point here is that the official diagnostic criteria are other directed, not that people who have neurodivergences don't suffer in various ways from having the neurodivergence, but that the way that it gets defined through this health lens is inherently other defined, right? But the other thing to say is, and I mean, I do think that any form of neurodivergence is a challenge that often comes along with deficits and suffering of various kinds. I suspect that being neurotypical also comes along with various deficits and suffering of various kinds. But what I want to say is that we are very ill-placed at this moment in history to know to what extent the disabling features of neurodivergence are socially produced or not, right? So in the case of substance abuse, for example, I can't prove this. Nobody can. I don't think there's good enough science. But my read on the science that we do have, plus just my read on the situation, is that an enormous amount of the substance abuse problems are a fairly direct result of pressure on neurodivergent people to mask in various ways that substance use can make more tolerable, and that we might not have disproportionate substance abuse problems if we were in a less ableist context. Again, I can't assert that. We don't know it, but we just don't know, right? We don't know to what extent some of these problems are produced by ableist culture rather than by the condition itself. Hard to know. In terms of social frustrations for autistic people, again, the more we are diagnosing people as autistic and creating autistic communities, the more we're finding that people who are autistic, when they have the opportunity, gravitate towards other neurodivergent people and then don't actually have that much trouble having a satisfying social life or having friends. So again, I think we just don't know. We're not in a position yet to know to what extent those social challenges are somehow intrinsic to the makeup of the person, and to what extent they're a matter of autistic people having up until now been almost exclusively isolated in neurotypical contexts without a good way of knowing how to find a network with other neurodivergent people. And so we just don't know. Now, I think all of that could be true. It could be true that the self-harm is produced by pressure to mask. It could be the fact that the social challenges are produced by being stuck in neurotypical contexts. And I still think it would count as a disability. Because if nothing else, it's a minority neurotype, right? And so there's inherent challenges and disabilities that go along with finding friends or fitting in or meeting the standards of the culture when your neurotype is in a minority. And that, that's not, I don't think that's going to change. And so I don't want to claim that it can stop being a disability, but I think that the forms, I think it's a beautiful test case of the social model of disability in the sense that the forms the disability takes and the seriousness of them are so interwoven with how neurodivergent people are situated within larger neurotypical culture that we just have no basis for knowing how much of that would be alleviated. But absolutely agree with your description of the actual situation. And the main thing I want to do is just reemphasize that my point here is about how the health framing has been in terms of letting down other people's needs and comfort level, and not about whether that's the entirety of the story. But thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll put you back on the queue for a separate question. Then why don't you pass the mic back to Krista?
Yeah, I succeeded. Sorry, I'm a practical philosopher. Thank you so much. I agree with a lot of things you're saying, actually, about the expansive notion of health becoming more or less well-being, and that healthism sort of is prominent. But I don't think the definition there was right, because there'd be indefeasible value of health. No, because as you said, the gymnast, we think it's okay, right, to actually sacrifice health for achievement. So I think that part I didn't agree with. But my question actually is about something you didn't mention, namely medication, right? Because what happens quite often, personal experience and family and so on, is that in order to get certain medication, that will actually help you. You need a diagnosis.
Yes, right.
So,
yeah.
And then you have to then frame it as a health issue, right?
Right.
In many countries, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question is rather, do you think medication can still be okay in these cases, or is it not okay because it's not a health issue, because medication is just for health issues?
Okay, so thanks. That was a complex question. Let me tease out some pieces. So first of all, indefeasible, I'm going to stand up for my definition, because indefeasible and infinite are not the same. So I want to say that even for a gymnast, we understand that the gymnast is supposed to value their health. It's just that at a certain point, other values can become even more trumping. But what you're not allowed to do is just simply not care about health, right? I mean, if you take a sport, this part isn't even bad. It's just a fact, right? If you do a sport, the coach will always do things like say, well, health comes first, safety comes first, even if they're kind of lying, and what they actually care about is you winning, right? But there's at least the healthist nod to, oh, what we really care about here is protecting your health. That doesn't mean it's an infinite value, right? It just means that you have to keep acknowledging it's a value and give an excuse if you're going to trump it in a certain context. Just like, sometimes people will have a piece of cake and they'll be like, oh, I know it's bad for me and I'm being bad and I shouldn't do it. And then they'll give a story about why something else. But I actually think the more interesting thing I want to focus on is the second part of what you were saying, because I think that this is a really hard issue and one I've thought about a lot, right? So I did say at the beginning that there are advantages to putting something under a health framework, including the fact that it gets it covered by insurance and so on, and access to medications and treatments is a great example of one of those benefits. We have an exactly analogous discussion to have when it comes to, for example, gender affirming surgery and hormones, right? Which we also, I don't want to frame being trans as a health problem, but there's complicated questions about how to get people access to interventions and medications that are going to genuinely make their life better without buying into these pathology models, right? So that's hard. I think in the case of neurodivergence, it's not quite as hard because, like I said, we can ignore, well, no, let me take back the not quite as hard. Some parts of it are easier because we can acknowledge that something is not itself a health condition, but that it causes health problems that themselves can be helped by medication, right? So if you have anxiety or depression that is connected with neurodivergence, anxiety and depression are themselves medical diagnoses that we can now prescribe things for, right? So it's not like the medication has to be prescribed for the whole condition. It can be prescribed for a health problem that is a result of the condition. But before you jump back in, I realize that that doesn't take care of things like stimulants for ADHD attention patterns, right? There isn't really medication for autism, but for ADHD, we have things like stimulants and so on. And so I think the really hard question, and this is not just a question about neurodivergence, it's a really hard question, is how do we think as a society about interventions that are medicalized in the sense that they are under the control of health institutions and pharmaceutical companies and so on, but where we want to think of the medication as making our lives socially better or better in other ways that are not addressing a health problem. And this is a generalized problem, right? Like, for example, I just had a graduate student who just defended a dissertation on contraception, which is a medical intervention that does not treat a health problem, right? And we're comfortable with that one for some reason, or most of us, even though at the same time we say things like, oh, well, there should be a health problem there if we give. So, we already have this problem, and somehow we need to rethink the role of institutions of medicine so that it's not completely decoupled from pathology and health, because that I don't think makes any sense, but where it's not so tightly wedded to health that we feel like we have to pathologize any condition in order to get a claim on medicine, right? So I think we should have access to medication. We shouldn't have to pathologize it in order to do that. That's a much broader problem that we have that comes up all over the place. I'm not sure exactly what the best route is to institutionalizing it, but I think it's a really thorny social problem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a short reply. So I meant by indefeasible, not possible to be defeated. That was my understanding of indefeasible. Anyway, that's not important. The thing was with the attention, though, because as you said, it's attentional difference. And here you actually, the medication is supposed to change that, something about that, right? And I thought your idea was you shouldn't. You should adjust the environment and not change the internal attention difference. That's a difference that should be respected, so to speak. But medication, of course, will change the
temporarily.
And I thought that was problematic on your view.
Temporarily it will. No. I mean, so I think that if we lived in a utopian society where anybody uncomfortable with clock time didn't have to be on it and could go off and do some different kind of thing, the use of attention drugs like Adderall and so forth would go way down. It probably wouldn't become zero because there are some much more limited things that they're very useful for, right? But I think what we see, this is related to my answer to the first question too, right? It's hard to know how much of this is social, right? I want to steer a line. You hear both of these camps, and I think they're both too extreme. I want to steer a middle course here. On the one hand, I do think a lot of people with ADHD end up being over medicated so that they can be jammed into clock time and productivity culture, and their attention is being more changed than is good for their individual flourishing. At the same time, I want people to have access to tools and aids and supports that temporarily change their attention as needed in ways that genuinely help them flourish. So I'm not an anti-medication person, but I wish we lived in a world where people could be on stimulants when and to the extent that that was serving as I'm not an essentialist about the natural body. If something is useful to you to make you flourish more, use it, right? But I wish people could be doing that towards the end of flourishing and in a more temporary way, rather than jamming these drugs into people in this widespread way so that they become more socially conformist. So that's the sort of middle path I want to get. But my position is coherent only because of the other thing I said, which is the much trickier thing, that we have to like rethink this whole simple link between medication and pathologization and make that subtler.
Okay, the queue's metastasizing a little bit. So
I'm
we have
sorry.
No, it's great engagement. So we have two people who want to follow up, and then we'll go on to the queue. Gustav, you may have to trade whether you want your follow-up or your question. Okay, so then can we get the mic forward for Gustav to follow up?
Yeah, this became a follow-up. I was also thinking about this definition of healthism. I don't know if you can get it back on the slide.
Yeah,
if I remember
for sure.
correctly. But I think it had something about individual responsibility somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, let's say you took away that individual that you were individually responsible for maximizing it. Maybe we could say collective responsible for maximizing it. It wouldn't make it much better.
No, I think it makes it much worse.
Yeah, exactly. So I wonder, why is that in there? I mean, it seems to be that individually it's bad, and collectively it's even bad. So it's just bad, this idea of that we have some responsibility, individual, collective, for maximizing and for enforcing it.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with you. I wasn't trying to say it was better. I was just saying they're both part of it, right? I mean, in fact, we use what we see as people not individually taking responsibility as their health as a kind of a social weapon against them, to criticize them and see them as having some sort of ethical failing or being, So the individual responsibility is real. And then the collective responsibility, the fact that we're very comfortable with, collective policies and so forth that manipulate and coerce people's behavior as long as it's done in the name of health, is at least as much of a problem. I mean, I first got interested in this when I was working on the paper that Joe talked about in the introduction, and I wasn't thinking about neurodiversity at all. I was especially thinking about, I've written a couple papers on this, I was especially thinking of our practices around eating, right? And how the so-called environmental account of obesity, where the idea is the solution to the obesity problem is you change people's environment so that they're sort of like, remolded to make better choices, has been seen as a as a progressive thing. But there have been some wonderful critiques of it showing how what it actually does is sort of impose elitist norms and images of how you're supposed to eat on people who don't necessarily want to eat that way because they have other eating traditions and they have other eating rituals and they have other eating preferences. And they're just told, well, it's, obviously unproblematic to rip those away from you and redesign your environment to make you into this other kind of eater because it's healthier, right? So yeah, I agree with you. The collective version is super creepy a lot of the time. I just think that, as a matter of fact, we see both horns of healthism in practice. We see the individual responsibilization and we see the collective paternalism and authoritarianism around how people act. Yeah.
Okay, then Dimitri, who's online, also wants to follow up on this.
I never know where to look for that.
So I think that's easiest for you.
Okay. Yeah.
Dimitri, are you there?
I don't hear anything just for the...
Okay, Dimitri, you've got a few seconds to get yourself on there. Otherwise, we're going to move on. All right, let's go on to the next question, which was someone online, Mo Saraf.
Yeah, so we have Mo Saraf, who is in a place where he is unable to talk.
Okay.
So he wants me to read the question.
Oh, sure.
So this is, let me just give you this is Mo Saraf from RISE Research Institutes of Sweden, and focuses on urban planning and architecture.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And the question is, I would like to know the speaker's general idea or advice on how architecture and urban planning, the way our environment is built, how our environment is built physically might have an impact on quality of life for neurodivergent individuals?
Oh God, thank you. That's a great question. I have way too much to say about it, so I have to be really selective. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, really, ultimately, space and architecture and its connection to agency is like the thing I'm most interested in. So I have to like rein myself in here. Okay, I'm going to answer the question. I also don't know where to put my glance right now because I just yeah. I'm going to answer the question first indirectly by talking about deaf architecture, which is a much better developed field that I've become super fascinated in. So the best example of this is Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., which is the first and still only research university entirely for the deaf. And when they built it in, I think, the 19th century, they thought they were doing this out of an urge to not be ableist, to sort of like be respectful of the deaf community they were serving. They built it to basically look like a little mini Ivy. It was a very traditional looking campus with a campus green and the stone buildings. It just looked like, it's in the same city as Georgetown. It just looked like a little Georgetown or a little Harvard or a little Oxford. And it turns out that there's so much more you can do with deaf architecture. There were ways in which that original campus was absolutely unsuited to its student population. So, for example, it had very narrow halls. If you're deaf, you need to be able to walk next to the person you're talking to. Otherwise, you have to completely stop the conversation until you get where you're going, right? Because you need to be able to see them. So if you're walking in a file, it breaks the flow of conversation. So in the newer buildings at Gallaudet, which were designed by people who are specifically interested in deaf architecture, all the halls are very wide. But it gets much cooler than that, because you might think that's just an accommodation, right? Like normal hearing people can hear single file. So now deaf people get to do what normal people do. But one of the things that they did in the new buildings is, for example, they had floor-to-ceiling windows with indoor and outdoor patios, because deaf people, unlike hearing people, don't care if one of them's inside a building and one of them is outside of a building, as long as they can see each other. So they can have conversations directly through the walls, right? So this is a way in which it's not just that the architecture accommodates their deafness, it uses their deafness as a difference to be played with and amplified, right? Also the dorm rooms, for example, this is like the opposite of what you would want in a normal dorm room. The dorm rooms are made out of materials so that if they play music, it shakes the whole room, because they want to be able to feel the rhythms. That's how they engage with music. So the new architecture accommodates deaf deficits, but also doesn't assume that deafness is just a deficit to be accommodated. It finds ways of building an environment which allows deaf people to do things that they are especially good at and to express their deafness in cool ways. Now, what would that look like for neurodivergence? I think that we're still at the earlier accommodation stage so far, right? So we're starting to do things like add sensory rooms and quiet rooms so that people who have sensory sensitivities can either get out of the crowd and go to a quiet space or get stimulation if they need to. That's a huge advantage. But I don't think that we have a well-developed architecture yet of what it would mean to create spaces that don't just accommodate, but enable neurodiverse ways of living and being and helping that flourish. I suspect, and nobody quote me on this because I have no evidence for this except for like my own personal read, I strongly suspect that Maria Montessori was autistic. And I think that the Montessori classroom is probably an example of really good neurodiverse architecture, because if you think about it, the whole principle of a Montessori classroom is learning through interest-based attention rather than needs-based attention. Like that's the whole idea, right? I haven't seen it framed that way. I doubt she knew that's what she was doing, but I suspect that what she was doing was designing the architecture of a classroom that was especially suited to autistic and ADHD kids for learning. So we don't really know, but I hope that we can move to something more intentional and exciting along the lines of what's happened with deaf architecture rather than just the accommodation stuff that we have so far. But this is a topic that I love. Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. So let's go to the front row here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but you can go next.
I had the feeling.
No, you can be first, and then Valdemar will be next.
Mine was a fingering, was for the first question. But
I can go back.
it's
I'm
a
sorry.
clarificatory question also
Yeah,
at
sure.
the same time. So my name is Elena. I am a legal theorist, and I am very interested in neurodiversity. My question is, what is the definition of neurodiversity you have? What are the numbers that will be included? Because I know there are different definitions. Some people include giftedness, for instance.
Right.
Some people will say that giftedness is not included. Some people point out up to 30% of the population being neurodiverse, which is itself a very strange name because when we talk about neurodiversity, we include also neurotypical in it.
Right.
It's kind of oxymoronic sometimes. Talking about neurodiversity as disabled in that regard. But my question is that, what is your definition if you include gifted people in this category? If you will, what will be the numbers of people who belongs to this category? And if gifted people will be also included as part of the collective that can be potentially disabled?
Right. Okay. So yeah, this is a great question. And I think I'm always careful, although, who knows, I may have slipped up. I'm careful to not call individuals neurodiverse for exactly the reason you said, right? Like individual could be neurodivergent, but an individual can't be neurodiverse unless maybe they have multiple neurotypes at the same time, I guess. But so it's society that's neurodiverse. It's people that are neurodivergent. I'm also less and less sure that I really, truly believe in neurotypical people. I definitely believe in neurotypical culture. I think that, we have deeply entrenched institutions and social norms that are deeply based, whether explicitly or not explicitly, on an understanding of how people's neurotypes work, which to me means centrally how their attention gets engaged, how they cognitively process the world around them. And so I think neurotypical culture is very real. I think some people are more neurotypical than others, right? In the sense that they're better fit and more statistically on the norm with respect to fitting into neurotypical culture. But I suspect it is a continuum and that we will never have like a cutoff where we say you're, divergent enough that you count as neurodivergent, but you aren't. All we can have is like vague groupings. Having said that, I do think that there are different neurodivergences. There too, I'm not like metaphysically, I don't believe in natural kinds. I don't believe that there's some like settled determinate truth out there in the universe as to what counts as autism versus what doesn't, or where the line is between autism and ADHD. These are pragmatic groupings that pick up on real commonalities and real patterns. And it's not like we could just do such good quality science or such good quality metaphysics that we would figure out exactly where the lines, or like how many neurodivergences are there, right? Is autism one thing? Is it several things? I don't think that there are like fixed answers to this. My strong suspicion, I strongly feel that like for now, autism is a useful category, which picks up on real patterns. So is ADHD. But I also suspect that in 30 years, those terms will have gone out of fashion because we will have become more fine-grained. And we will have also realized that the overlap between them is enough that it's not the best way of dividing things up. I think it just seems clear to me that autism takes such different forms that it would be better to, in the long run, to separate it. So I don't think there's an answer to how many neurodivergences there are. And I don't think that there's an answer to exactly where the line is between neurodivergence and neurotypicality. But I think I can still answer your question, because I think that for me, what neurodivergence is, more generally, is systematically processing and attending to the world at the level of cognition, sensation, and bodily reaction in a way that is statistically non-standard enough that it makes you a friction-y, rough fit with how the world is set up to accommodate our neurotypes, right? And again, I think that's a continuum. As for giftedness, I'm not sure what to say. I don't think giftedness is itself a disability. I do think that, and I also think giftedness comes in many, many different forms. I do think that there are probably really large overlaps between intellectual giftedness and other forms of neurodivergence. And then there's some obvious sense in which it's a neurodivergence, right? Like if you just process everything much more efficiently and better than the statistical norm, that is a way of diverging from the norm. And it can make things like normal classrooms boring and normal jobs boring, right? And so there's some obvious sense in which, okay, yeah, sure, I think it's a neurodivergence. I don't think it's a disability in and of itself, but I think that it often, very often, co-travels with various kinds of disability, right? So you just have really high numbers of intellectually gifted people who are also ADHD or also autistic or whatever it may be. And also, those aren't two completely separate facts about them, right? Like the way in which they're processing efficiently or deeply or well is itself a neurodivergent way of doing that. So I'm sorry, that was a really messy answer, and I don't know what the percentages are. But yeah, I mean, again, maybe it's because there's a lot of selection bias, and I always find myself in environments that select very highly for neurodivergence, like academia. But I just feel like true neurotypical people are hard to come by. You know? Every once in a while I meet one and I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, but again, neurotypical culture is a thing. And it's a thing that is much, much easier for many, many people to function within and cope with than other people.
So that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you very much to Quill. Before we give a final round of applause, let me just tell you about our next seminars before you lose your attention. Next week, we have Julie Gerbel talking about technological innovation facing climate change. And then on the 18th, Eli Cook, whose talk is titled Choose Your Own Captivity, Choice Architects and the Analog Origins of Digital Capitalism. So tune back in for those. But for now, let's thank Quill.
Thank you.